Dr. Ho Kwon Ping, who is joining us. He is Executive Chairman of Banyan Tree Holdings. He's going to talk about Singapore politics and the business in an age of disruption. Kwon Ping, invite you on stage, please.
Good morning or good afternoon, whatever it may be. Now, normally I should say that OCBC is my favorite bank, but I said normally I would have said OCBC is my favorite bank, except that somebody on your organizing committee has been quite mischievous. When I was first approached to sort of address this forum, somebody called me and said, oh, this is going to be one of your normal humdrum economic and business forums. You sit in at a panel discussion and talk about Singapore's economy, and then we'll get you out of there in 5 minutes. So I said, okay. And then they sent me the topic, which, of course, nobody else wants to talk about, which is Singapore politics. But I'm a very good Singaporean. I do as I'm told. And since I've been told to talk about Singapore politics, since nobody else wants to talk about it, all I can say is that there's really too much and too little to say at the same time. Everyone points to the elephant in the room, but pretends it's not there. And of course, particularly after what's happened in Malaysia, the elephant that's beginning to surface itself, and which Dr. Mahathir had in his usual jibing way at Singapore highlighted, the elephant in the room, as he had alluded to, is the longevity of the PAP. Now, I got myself in this hot position simply because I was also foolish enough when I was asked to be the IPS S.R. Nathan inaugural fellow for the study of Singapore. I actually, again, took the orders from IPS to talk about Singapore politics and addressed what I thought was the elephant in the room, which is, I think, clear to all of us. And true enough, what I'd like to do today is just examine some of those assumptions and some of the statements I've made in the light of some more recent events. Now, the two major recent events, I guess, which I'd like to peg this very short talk on, is what happened in Singapore with the Singapore Summit and what it represents to us symbolically, and of course what happened across the causeway with the Malaysian elections. As I've mentioned, Dr. Mahathir, in his inimitable way, has really tugged the tail of the elephant when he made his remarks about how Singapore should be like Malaysia, and the Singaporean electorate should get tired of our government like Malaysia has gotten tired of its government. I'm sure all of you have seen that. We have all been very studiously quiet and non-responsive, which I think has been very wise, given the kind of reactions it could have provoked if we had officially reacted to a statement like that. Of course, those of you who read social media would note also that many others who have always been on the sidelines, who've been critical of Singapore from within or outside of Singapore, have jumped onto the bandwagon, and now people are actually predicting how many years or days or months left the PAP has got left to go, now that Barisan and UMNO has also fallen. Now, indeed, to any superficial observer, I think there are parallels between Singapore and Malaysia, and some of them can be even somewhat unnervingly close parallels. The first, of course, is that the Singapore political system is closest probably to the Malaysian one, to the extent that historically we have been part of the same Commonwealth, the same colonial history, the same anti-colonial independence struggle, and so on. So there's already the fact that Singapore and Malaysia's political systems have been very similar. The second one, of course, is that both the PAP and UMNO, or Barisan, have been founding parties in the independence of their own countries. Both the prime ministers, Najib and our own prime minister, are the sons of previous prime ministers. Both political systems are democratic and parliamentary democracies, but are somewhat more authoritarian than others within the Commonwealth. But I think that if one were to take these, what I would say, somewhat unnervingly similar parallels between Singapore and Malaysia, and to draw the kind of conclusion that Dr. Mahathir has drawn, we would make a very foolish mistake. There's one huge and critical difference, and that is that, in my view, it is not the absence of full democratic institutions, it is not the absence of full human rights or the sort of putting down of dissent, nor the presence of paternalistic governance, which brings down a government or has brought down the Malaysian government. It is the unbridled, blatant, egregiously blatant, and massively enormous corruption of the Najib government which brought him down. And to make any other closer parallels to Singapore other than that would be a huge mistake. Now, I was listening with interest with what Lord Desai said about corruption. And clearly, from an economist's point of view, corruption as a lubricant within many developing economies have long existed and have not been necessarily detrimental to economic growth. But the corruption that has been exhibited in parts of Asia, particularly, let's say, if you're talking about within ASEAN, only 2 countries have exhibited the massive corruption which has brought down Malaysia's government, and the only other one is basically Cambodia. And like my good friend Bilahari, being a non-diplomat today, I can actually openly name governments, which I'm sure you will name later on, and become more controversial than I am, hopefully. The point I had made in my lectures, which were then put into the book called The Ocean and a Drop, was that the elephant in the room, which is the longevity of the PAP, clearly is an issue. It is so fundamental to the stability of Singapore that we cannot ignore it. It is something we do have to talk about if we are, as Singaporeans, concerned about Singapore's future. But we would be drawing the wrong lessons if we were to simply look at Malaysia today and think that the fall of the PAP is imminent for whatever reasons occurred across the causeway. My own predictions in my lectures and in my book was that I think that the demise of the PAP, which is already one of the longest-lasting political parties in the world, might well be possible, but not within the next 20 to 30 years, largely because I think if you look at the history of many post-independence founding parties, you will find that the passion and the integrity and the vision of the founding fathers usually persist for about 3 generations. Beyond there, then, the danger starts, hubris sets in, and the rot begins in many, many countries of the developing world. We are still in our largely 2nd-generation leadership. The memories of the founding fathers and the principles that were set by Lee Kuan Yew, I think, are clearly still remembered and clearly still perpetuated by the current leadership. The question is, after this, then what? I think it will not be, in my view, it is not going to be, as is the popular Western view, that it is going to be the absence of democratic institutions which will bring down a government like the PAP. I think Asian political culture has shown that it is not just the presence of democratic institutions, but it is the presence of good governance which is most critical. There is a high degree of tolerance within Asian societies for even incompetence. But there is very little tolerance for totally selfish regimes which only perpetuate their own well-being. And as if you've seen from even Chinese history, and the fact that dynasties are overthrown regularly simply because they've lost the mandate of heaven or the political legitimacy which arises from good governance, you can recognize that Asian societies are equally able to overthrow their leaders as Western societies if they believe that good governance no longer exists. And I think that's one lesson that the Chinese Communist Party is clearly aware of. The cynics amongst us may well say that Xi Jinping, in his anti-corruption campaign, has used it conveniently to also silence many of his rivals. And that's undoubtedly true. But I think there's also a very clear recognition within the Chinese Communist Party that it's not going to be the freedom of speech or the suppression of some demonstrations that's going to bring down the Chinese Communist Party. It is going to be massive corruption which affects everyone and which affects the entire legitimacy of the Communist Party that will bring it down. And that's why, to me, today, we currently do not have that problem in Singapore because corruption is still kept very well under control. Now, the $64,000 question obviously is going to be, what can lead to one of the world's least corrupt political systems, which is what we have today in Singapore, very proudly so, as one of the least corrupt political systems in the world? What could change the entire ballgame so that corruption begins to set in Singapore? I see three possible causes or reasons for this. The first is nepotism and cronyism. And I do think we have to be careful here. If you look across the border, there are many people who are ministers who are the children and relatives of politicians and ministers. And I would hope that we do not make that same mistake in Singapore. You also have, as is talked about, cronyism. Cronyism in the normal sense involves politicians and business people. But I think in the Singapore context, we also have to be careful that we do not create quasi-cronyism amongst cliques of elites, whether they've come from within the military or the admin service, or as people has already observed, what percentage of cabinet today are in fact RJC graduates. I am not alluding, of course, and I'm being a little bit provocative here, I'm not alluding to the fact that cronyism exists in Singapore, but I am saying that we must be careful not to have an increasingly ingrown political elite, which draws upon itself, draws from its own immediate circles of friends, children, and relatives, or draws upon the military elites or the administrative elites. There must be an inflow of fresh, totally fresh new blood into the political system if we are to avoid the futures that we do not wish to have. The second point I think we need to be careful about is hubris, complacency, and what one would call the boiling frog syndrome. You know, the boiling frog syndrome is a situation where apparently if you I haven't tried it, I must admit. I don't want I wouldn't want to get into trouble, but apparently the boiling frog syndrome, as we know, is where you have a pot of water that's getting hotter and hotter, and you have a frog that you put in there, and basically the frog quiescently, obediently dies because it does not perceive that the world around it or the water temperature has changed. It gets boiled alive. Are we really just walking the talk when we talk about how we are living in a world of disruption? Are we applying the same old formulas to solve the problems of the future simply because everything that worked in the past we think will work again? I think we have to be very careful about hubris. And the final last part I think we have to be clearly worried about is that while we have a very robust and an excellent political system of good governance today, clearly there is a lack of internal competition. Now, we all talk about how unity is very good and factionalism is bad. But to some extent, factionalism, even within politics, induces some kind of political competition. The world generally talks about how the Chinese Communist Party is a monolithic institution, unlike the vibrant democracy you get in Westminster or in the US system. I think many people tend to forget that there is, in fact, intense political competition within the Chinese Communist Party itself. For Xi Jinping to have risen, the kind of competition that you have already institutionalized within the Chinese Communist Party between people coming from within the Communist Youth League or the Princelings or various other units, the kind of political competition you get within the LDP with its own factionalism has not always been necessarily bad. Factionalism, to a great extent, to over factionalism is not necessarily good, but we also need more political competition. Otherwise, we'll become a bit like a Catholic Church, where aging cardinals come together and they sort of vote for another aging cardinal to come in, and they just replace each other without much competition. Of course, my Catholic friends have told me that the Catholic Church is one of the oldest, longest surviving institutions in the world. So obviously, it also must work too. I think the final point here is that the one point we do need to see, I think most political observers would make from would conclude from what has happened in Malaysia, is that despite a few elections already of increasing disenchantment by the populace against the government, what turned it this time round was that essentially the ruling party split. No doubt you can say Dr. Mahathir and others were already not leading the Barisan Nasional or UMNO, but essentially it was a split within the ruling party that made the difference. I think for all of us and for Singapore's sake, we would not want to see the kind of politics that would lead to a split within the PAP and the kind of disruptions to our lives. But I do think there are lessons to be drawn, and I'm certain that our own political leadership is not basking in any kind of complacency. I think our political leadership is well aware that the jibes that are made against us and our political system by our friends across the causeway may not be applicable in totality, but there clearly are lessons to be learned. There are lessons about hubris, there are lessons about keeping in close touch with the population, there are lessons about keeping scrupulously clean and avoiding any possibility of corruption to infect the political system. That would be a few remarks about politics in Singapore and Malaysia. Don't think I want to make any more comments about Malaysia itself. That I will leave to Bilahari to do, which he has promised me he has said he will do. No? You'll make comments about China instead, Bilahari. My only other point here is about regional positioning. And I think I just wanted to take the symbolic reference to the Singapore Summit to make the point that I think even in a world where our own relevance to the region has clearly diminished over time, at a time when the role of Singapore's sort of geopolitical positioning as a hub for aviation has declined, with even the airports in Bangkok, the two airports in Bangkok generating more traffic than Singapore, with ports coming up in Indonesia, with BRI, in fact, taking away quite a lot of the logistical and infrastructure flow away from the Straits of Malacca in the future. Even with all of that, the fact that Korea and the United States chose Singapore to hold its Singapore Summit, I think says a lot symbolically about the role that we can create for ourselves. And that is a global role. Politically, I think we can be more proactively neutral. We perhaps have not done a sufficiently good job in the past, and that I will leave to the next speaker to talk about, but I have my own views. I wouldn't want to clash with you here openly, sir. But I do think that in this whole debate internally we've had in Singapore about whether we are sufficiently pro-China or pro-United States, I think we need to be more actively promoting the fact that we are proactively neutral to all countries. But in the larger issue about where do we stand economically, I think that the future of Singapore remains still a very bright one, and largely because we have created within Singapore clusters of industries that depend so much on an interlocking set of competencies which are highly complex, involving legal proficiencies, intellectual capabilities, physical infrastructures that make it impossible for other countries to easily emulate or overtake within 5 to 15 years. I think one good example is aviation. For anyone to claim today that Singapore Airlines is the top airline in the world, it would be more difficult than before. To claim that Changi Airport is the world's biggest aviation hub would in fact not be true. But if you would look at the global situation of aviation, from leasing to avionics manufacturing, to the fact that Rolls-Royce has only got 2 manufacturing, not MRO, but 2 manufacturing centers in the entire world. One is Singapore, and the other one is in the UK. To a whole host of other facts, one can still conclude that in the field of aviation in totality, Singapore remains still a very critical global hub. And we can create these competencies in other clusters, whether it be in pharmaceuticals, life sciences, global logistics and infrastructure, and other areas. Because as we begin to become less important in some areas, and unfortunately, I'm not sure in the world of capital markets and equities whether the Singapore Stock Exchange can ever become more global, and in certain areas we may have to be secondary. But I think there are clearly areas where, as the Singapore Summit has shown symbolically, we clearly shine out amongst all others in the world. And this little red dot, therefore, will still be able to survive for quite a while longer. Thank you very much.